All right, good morning, class. I am going to pick up where I left off today in class. I was lecturing on the ancient Shang and Zhou dynasties, and I didn't get as far as I would like to have, but I'm going to spend a little time here in screencast mode trying to make up for what was not accomplished in class today. So these are the objectives, and I'll just, they're here. You can always, as always, you can stop and pause these screencasts whenever you see fit if you need to write things down or if I'm going too fast. And I'm just going to speed through some things. We talked a little bit, I spent some time in class today talking about how China's basic geography, or I guess I should say East Asia's basic geography, creates certain realities, the climatic zones. You'll notice from north to south, China goes from relative aridity and lack of rainfall to, in the southeast, in this area, quite a bit of it. And this has consequences for the kinds of agriculture China has practiced throughout time. And in the north, we tend to have a little less productive, but still important staples like wheat and millet. And then in the south, which is truly the bread basket, of course, that's a little bit of a misnomer, right? I guess I should call it the rice basket, which is where much of the nutrients for East Asia comes from, is in this high precipitation area and region of China. We talked about how silk and bronze are all, and even jade were evident from pretty early moments in China's history, and these have had consequences for things like trade, art, and really, I guess I'll spill the beans here a little bit, until 1700, 1800 in world history. I'm talking 17, 1800 current era. China was really the envy of global trade for many of the superior and impressive trade goods that one could realize from a trade relationship with China. Okay, so we talked a little bit. We talked about the Shang dynasty reaching back almost 5,000 years ago, and how we have evidence of early writing in the Shang dynasty as evident in these things called oracle bones. I talked about how this was a form of divination. This was a form of trying to learn about future events and also to try to change future events in a positive way. And really the way that this worked was the Chinese, as early as the Shang, their priests and their kings would ask a question, and essentially their earliest hopes were that by etching a question into the bone of an animal or the shell of a turtle, say, that they could receive an answer. And what they were doing by etching these questions was actually asking their ancestors, those who had gone before them, to intercede or to intervene and change the outcome of events so that they would happen in a more favorable way. This reveals to us something a little bit about how the ancient Chinese or the ancient Shang believed about their world, but it also gives to us this really important form of writing. Typically they would etch their question along with the ancestor they were directing that question to, and then they would also record the outcome of their oracle, what became of their question, what resulted from their request of their ancestors. Tough to tell exactly how that is all evident on, say, this oracle bone, but there were thousands upon thousands of these oracle bones that historians and archaeologists have unearthed and have compared them, and it does seem as though our historical understanding of them is more or less accurate. Okay, this guy here, his name is Sima Qian. He is a famous Chinese historian. Sima Qian, his name is actually spelled S-I-M-A capital Q-I-A-N, but we pronounce that Sima Qian. And he's a source of really important things that we have come to know about ancient China. You'll see he didn't write until the 1st century BCE, but he recorded about events going back well over 1,000 years. So in some ways, we have to be a little careful because he's obviously relating what is probably stories that were told and retold until they were finally given to him. But nonetheless, he is a starting point for trying to understand some important events. Sima Qian is kind of like a lot of Chinese historians, and he shared some of the beliefs of people of his time. And what he believed was that China could never have more than one king at a time. And so as a result of this, his stories of Shang era and later Zhou-Era China are going to speak as though the Shang were the only powerful people. And as we know, the Shang dynasty was a relatively small part of China. There were other people. What separates the Shang is that their writing has endured more clearly and more effectively than other ancient regions within China. He has, as it says here, the Shang dynasty has the only written records, and therefore its history has lingered much more lively, much more accurately than others. Worth noting that we have unearthed numerous Shang tombs, and these tombs have revealed to us a couple things. First off, the Shang practiced human sacrifice. Oftentimes when they went into war against neighboring societies, they would take prisoners. Some of those prisoners they would turn to slaves. Others they would actually sacrifice. We also have evidence in the Shang era tombs that when kings died, they were buried with lots of other people. And it's a little difficult to know for sure whether people were put to death and buried with the king. That's one prominent theory. But the people who were buried with the king reflected their own rank within society. So the everyday laborers were at the bottom, the petty aristocrats above the laborers, the high-ranking government officials, priests, so on and so forth, buried at the top and closer to the king. So these are really interesting practices, and later empires or dynasties will show at least an echo of some things. We'll talk later this week about the terracotta soldiers that were buried around Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, the great Qin emperor, but more on that later. Okay, around 1200 or so, China will make a major shift from its Shang dynasty to the Zhou dynasty. And the Zhou dynasty is a long-lasting dynasty, as you can see here, roughly 800 years, from 1045 BCE to the mid-3rd century BCE. And one of the most important things, the Zhou don't have a whole lot of historical importance, I would argue. Well, let me correct that. We can really appreciate the Zhou's contributions to Chinese history by understanding a basic concept known as the mandate of heaven. But then I also want to follow up and note that during the Zhou dynasty, it was a golden age of ancient Chinese philosophy. And as you read and prepare documents in the Confucian tradition, in the Taoist tradition, and in the legalist tradition, you'll perhaps have a better appreciation for all that happened during this period in time. But we can simplify it quite a bit by thinking of this idea of the mandate of heaven. And the mandate of heaven came about and was an important sort of justification, because in Chinese history, like in a lot of places, it wasn't acceptable to just go around killing kings and replacing them. And if a new dynasty came into being, which is true of the Zhou dynasty, a new family, a new hereditary succession of rulers is going to come into power. And in order to justify that, there needed to be some explanation. And the mandate of heaven essentially became that explanation. Toward the end of the Zhou dynasty, things were not going so well for China. There were things like floods, famines, droughts. There was all sorts of suggestion by Sima Qian, the historian that we mentioned in the last slide, that the last and final Shang-era emperors were corrupt, that they served themselves, that they drank excessively, and that they failed to rule on behalf of the Chinese people. If they'd been in Egypt, they would have been accused of not following the Ma'at. But since they're in China, they are going to fall short of a new concept for legitimate rule known as the mandate of heaven. And the mandate of heaven held that heaven was essentially a god, but not necessarily a god like in the image of man, but a god like in the sense of this all-encompassing aura, this essentially heaven, like the sky, the god of the sky. And essentially heaven determined whether or not a leader was legitimate or not. And the way you would know whether a leader held the legitimacy of heaven was based on how events transpired or how events took place during that emperor's rule. So clearly what had happened at the end of the Zhou dynasty in the form of famines and floods and natural disasters and uprisings by the people is that the Zhou emperors had failed to continue to have the mandate of heaven. I'm sorry, that the Shang had failed to continue to hold the mandate of heaven. And this made it possible and even legitimate for the Zhou dynasty, the early Zhou emperors, to take power, and therefore their power became legitimate. Okay? The Zhou dynasty is going to be divided up into a couple different pieces. The Western Zhou, by the 8th century BCE, the Western Zhou capital in the interior of China is going to no longer be safe, and it will be moved farther east, and this sort of is evidence of a dynasty in decline. And ultimately, in 221 BCE, the Zhou dynasty will come to an end, and there will be a warring states period prior to the arrival of the Qin dynasty. Iron will become a technology and a material that becomes increasingly common in China during the Zhou. Used for things like coins and also for other practical tools and implements. Also, it's worth noting that during the Zhou dynasty, the character of warfare will start to change. What had once been a sort of aristocratic simply means a high-class practice. Chariots and horses had been sort of the style of warfare in the Shang. During the Zhou, the nature of warfare is going to become a little bit more democratic, and what I mean by that is foot soldiers will become more and more an important part of the military structure, and as such it will mean that more people can participate in the military conflicts, and it gives opportunity for the poor or those from lower status within society to participate. Sima Qian, remember that historian, he actually said that when the Shang and the Zhou came together on the battlefield, that the Shang had 700,000 warriors and that the Zhou had something like 50,000. So clearly, according to Sima Qian, the Shang dynasty had a considerable military advantage, but it was because of the lack of the mandate of heaven. Because the Shang lacked the backing of heaven, it was the Zhou who prevailed even over incredible odds that were stacked against it. Warring states, more foot soldiers, and we'll see how that becomes definitely a part of the reality of the late Zhou period. Lastly, I'm just going to say this, we're almost out of time, but during the Zhou dynasty, some really important philosophies of Asian society come into being: Confucianism, legalism, and Taoism. And with that, I will stop and look forward to talking to you tomorrow.